Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hebruki-Raring, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. This webinar series is designed to help you to get to know NOAA's work in Alaska and how we connect and work with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA or work in partnership with NOAA. We hope this gives you a sneak peek at different career paths you might be interested in. Today, we're introducing you to Pam Goddard, Vanessa Lowe, and Rachel Wilborn, who work for the NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle, Washington. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we are all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial Indigenous knowledge and much to share with us. In Alaska, the data that Pam, Vanessa, and Rachel work with are collected in the Bering Sea, Aleutian Islands, and Gulf of Alaska, which are the traditional home waters of the Inupiat, Yup'ik, and Siberian Yup'ik people, the Nungaak, Alutiiq, Sigpiaq, Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian people. We would like to acknowledge that Pam is presenting from Eastham, Massachusetts, the traditional lands of the Nauset tribe. Vanessa is presenting from El Segundo, California, close to Los Angeles, located within the traditional lands of the Tongva Nation. Rachel Wilborn is presenting from, and we are hosting the webinar from, the greater Seattle area, and we acknowledge the Coast Salish peoples of this land, which touches the shared waters of the Duwamish, Puyallup, Squamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speakers. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure that everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions, and we encourage you to ask them as we go. My colleague Chris Beyer and I will be keeping track of questions behind the scenes for our speakers. They'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We may not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, I'll hand it over to our speakers to introduce themselves.
Thank you so much, Lisa. So as she mentioned, today we have three presenters. My name is Vanessa Lowe, and I'm located in El Segundo, California, right now near Los Angeles. We also have Pam Goddard, who will be presenting today from Eastham, Massachusetts, which is near Boston, and Rachel Wilborn, who's presenting from Seattle, Washington. But all three of us work in the waters surrounding Alaska. I first got interested in marine biology as a kid growing up in Southern California. And I was just fascinated by the tide pools there. So in high school, I volunteered at a local aquarium where they let me work on a science fair project with jellyfish, which really steered my desire to work in marine biology in college. So I moved to Washington for school and got a summer job as a field assistant collecting fish and tide pools in Canada and Alaska, where I got to camp and kayak to collection spots, which really fueled my interest in field work. After college, I got a job with NOAA Fisheries doing lab work in Seattle and field work on boats in Alaska. So I got to travel to a whole bunch of new places like Nome, Dutch Harbor, Kodiak, and St. Paul Island. Now I'm excited to get to try something new again as a member of the Deep Sea Coral and Research Technology Group. And so now I will pass on to introduce you to Pam Goddard.
Hi, my name is Pam Goddard, and I'm presenting to you today from Eastham, Massachusetts. I was born in San Juan, Puerto Rico, and from there, my family moved up and down the East Coast between Connecticut, Virginia, and Massachusetts. I had two passions, horses and the beach, as a kid. Because of my father's job, we spent our summers on Cape Cod, Massachusetts, with extended family, which is where I learned to explore the natural world around me, from canoeing in the marsh to harvesting clams and fishing. I started college as a pre-med student, and quickly realized I was more interested in the natural world than the human body. After college, I traveled through Canada to Alaska and fell in love with Alaska. I found a job as a foreign fisheries observer and eventually became a full-time employee at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center in Seattle. My work in Alaska has taken me to many beautiful and wild places. And 7 years ago, I transitioned from working in fisheries to working with corals and sponges, which brings me here to you today. So now I'm going to pass it over to Rachel so she can introduce herself.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel. I'm originally from Michigan, which isn't on a big ocean, but it did have a lot of water, and I was an avid fan of animals, as you can see, and I often would be at the beach playing in the water, even though it was fresh water. So I actually started out with working in aquariums at in Chicago and in Maryland, and then I went to grad school for marine biology in Florida, where I worked a lot with sharks for a little while, and then I got into coral reefs in the Florida Keys. And I worked in Florida Keys for quite a while on shallow water corals, but moved to Seattle and discovered that Alaska just has a really beautiful array of deep water corals, and have continued to work here ever since. And I'm thrilled to be here with you guys today.
So I'm sure most of you have heard of corals before, but what images come to mind? Maybe you think of tropical waters and coral reefs, sunshine, and scuba divers. But did you know that there are corals that live right here in Alaska too? Many corals live in Alaska, over 140 different kinds. They live in very cold waters, some living in nearly freezing temperatures. They can be in shallow waters, but also very deep. So some of the deepest known corals in the world have been found at a depth of 20,000 feet. So to give you an idea of what that's like, the tallest mountain in the United States is Denali, located in Alaska, and that's about the same height, 20,000 feet. And the deepest corals in Alaska are at about 16,000 feet, and that's about the length of the longest cruise ship that comes to Alaska, 14 of them put together end to end. So because deep sea coral or deep sea exploration is difficult, there's still a lot to learn about deep sea environments and the creatures that live there. So part of our jobs is to learn more about corals and sponges that live in Alaskan waters. This map shows all managed areas where we collect corals and sponges. But these areas marked in pink and orange are where most of the corals are located, on the eastern Bering Sea slope, the Aleutian Islands, and the Gulf of Alaska. But what is a coral? Do you think it's an animal, a mineral, or maybe a plant? Does anybody have any ideas?
So those of you who are in our audience, if you think that coral is an animal, a mineral, or a plant, please type it into our box. I see that we have some answers already. I think that Kaylee and Jordan are thinking that it's an animal. Anne is thinking that, Danny is thinking that it's an animal. Theodore is thinking a plant. And Erde is thinking animal. Stella is thinking an animal. We've got a lot of people thinking an animal. Texas from Colorado thinks it's an animal. Yeah, most people are saying that they're animals, although Theodore is also saying it's an underwater plant. And we got a couple of families that are split where Nadia is saying, my son says animal, my daughter says plants, and then Michelle says it's all three. So what do you think, Vanessa? What can you help us out with here?
Well, you guys are very clever. So you're right, sometimes it's all three of them, but all corals are animals. Most of them are colonial, and they live they're a collection of very small polyps that live together to form a colony. And the coral colony builds a skeleton that's made of minerals that are absorbed from the ocean. And then some corals, like some of the tropical corals, also have plants that are living inside them. So in this picture, you can see the clear polyp, but then the little brown spots in there are actually algae that lives within the tissues of the coral polyp. But what is a coral polyp? So they have a soft sac-like body with tentacles. They look similar to an anemone if you've seen one of those before. They have stingers on the tentacles with a mouth in the center that leads to its gut. Many of the tropical corals also have algae living inside them, which I mentioned before, and these algae are called zooxanthellae. So these two organisms are living together with a mutual benefit, and that's called a symbiotic relationship since they're both benefiting. The coral provides a place for the algae to live and get access to sunlight, while the algae provides 95% of the food to the corals by using sunlight to make the food for the coral. So this adaptation works well at shallow depths, but what do you think about Alaskan corals? There's some that live in shallow waters, like in this picture here at 70 feet with the diver. You can see a coral there, where they have access to sunlight. However, the sun only penetrates to the ocean at about 600 feet deep. So many of the corals in Alaska live where it's cold and dark and too deep for the sunlight to get through. So because algae can't make food for the coral without sunlight, how do you think these deep water corals get their food?
So for those of you in the audience, how do you think that the corals get food in the dark without any sunlight? So we're getting a couple of questions, a couple of thoughts that Dorothy is saying maybe it's food passing by. Robin is saying with their tentacles. Oren is saying plankton. Maybe they feed on the plankton. And Stella is thinking about underwater hydrothermal vents. Kim is saying that they have stinging tentacles. And Danny is saying that they filter feed with small organisms. So what can you tell us about that, Vanessa?
Also, these are some really great ideas, but those of you that mentioned them eating zooplankton and using their tentacles to catch it are spot on. So corals are sessile, which means that they can't move from where they're attached to catch their food. So they have to use their tentacles to catch the food that's floating by in the water, like zooplankton or even brine shrimp. Hidden in the coral tissues are these special stinging cells. The stinging cells help catch the prey with a poisonous barb that's attached to a thread from a specialized organelle called a nematocyst. So the prey can then be drawn into the stomach cavity where it's digested. These stinging cells, they can also be used for protection. So another way that the coral can protect itself is to pull its body into the skeleton. So in this picture, you can see there's some open polyps, and so those ones are sort of ready to be feeding or doing their coral thing. But these ones are closed, and so they're pulled in, so they might be eating or they might be trying to protect themselves. So do you think that the polyps feed individually, or do you think they work as a team to provide nutrition to the colony?
So what do you guys think? Do you think that the polyps work individually, so it's every polyp for itself, so to speak, or do they work as a team to feed the whole coral colony? So what we see here is Johanna and Asher are saying that they work as a team. Texas is saying they work as a team. Nadia think they work as a team. Kim thinks they work as a team. Most people are thinking that they work as a team. Yeah, I think everybody who's typed in has said that.
Yeah, so that way they can work on growing and making a bigger colony over time. But we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So does anybody else have any questions?
Well, thanks for asking, Vanessa. We do have some questions on the line here. So Kaylee and Jordan were wondering, how are coral formed? And you touched on that a little bit when you were talking about how the coral feed as a group, but what can you tell us?
Well, so the next segment is going to talk quite a bit about that, but when corals are young, they attach to a hard surface and then they begin to grow, but I don't want to ruin Rachel's part of the talk, so I'll let her elaborate on that.
And then we did have a couple, so Theodore was wondering whether those stinging cells, the nematocysts, whether they hurt when they actually sting.
You know, to be honest, I don't know for small animals. I think that it can probably paralyze a very small animal, but if you were to touch it, our skin is so thick that you're not going to feel it as a hurt. It might feel more like sticky, like when you touch an anemone.
And then Kim was wondering how large are cold water corals as compared to those in the tropics? And maybe we'll get into that a little later too.
We will, but we know that some of the corals in Alaska can get up to 10 feet tall. I'm not sure how much bigger because we haven't found out all of them yet, but 10 feet tall for sure. And but there's many corals in tropical areas that are much bigger than that.
Great. And then Theodore had wanted to know whether when the polyps are feeding, do they take turns when they're open and closed, or do they take turns sleeping and wake? Do they even sleep and wake?
You know, I don't know that they sleep, but they do open and close at different times. Like in that last picture we looked at, you notice that within the same colony, there's some that are open and some that are closed.
Great. Well, I think that we might hold the rest of our questions until the next section, because I know that Rachel is going to cover a lot of the questions that are being considered here. Great. So Rachel, oh, I'm going to pass the presenter over to Rachel. Here we go. Got it. So you're on now, Rachel.
Thanks, Lisa. Is my screen showing for everyone?
Yep.
Okay, great. So yeah, a lot of you are already sort of asking some questions that make a lot of sense when you talk about eating, and that's how do corals grow? When we eat, we often grow, and then how old are corals? So just for an example, on the left-hand side of this picture, we've got a little small coral that's about 6 centimeters tall, and over the years, it's going to grow and eventually become as big as the coral that's on the right there, that's 150 centimeters tall. But how long does that take, and how do scientists know how to measure that? And so what we actually do is we know that there's growth rates for certain types of corals, and this specific coral grows at about 1.3 centimeters per year. So based on that growth rate, the coral on the right is actually almost maybe about 110 years old, which is just amazing. And so not only can they grow very large and get very old, they also grow in a really amazing array of shapes and sizes. So here's some examples of just some different corals that are all found in Alaska waters. And they can look like really tall sticks. The ones in the upper right can actually get over 6 feet tall. They can look like mushrooms, like the one in the upper right-hand corner, flowers, corkscrews, or even just really big, funky-looking trees. And most of the corals we observe in Alaska are soft corals, but what's the difference between a hard and a soft coral? So we've got hard corals on the left-hand side. They actually build layers using a stony mineral called limestone or calcium carbonate. It's kind of like what you notice when you hold a shell. And they use that and they build layer on layer like a skyscraper or an apartment complex. And they build up and they're growing towards the sunlight. So in shallow water, they're trying to reach the sunlight. And the coral polyp is always in the top floor with their zooxanthellae reaching for the sun. And shallow water corals can grow really fast compared to their deep water cousins. Shallow water corals can grow up to 20 centimeters per year, which is about the length of an unsharpened pencil. If you take a look at our deep sea corals, though, in Alaska, they grow really slowly. So they actually only grow about the length of from the tip of your thumb to your first knuckle in a year. So much slower than our shallow water cousins. And instead of having a solid bony limestone structure, they actually have these tiny bony plates. And you can see in the lower right-hand corner, there's a microscopic picture of little bony plates, and those are called sclerites. And this allows for the coral to be more flexible, but still maintain a structure. So I like to tell people to think of like the tip of your nose, how we have cartilage there. Your nose has a shape, but it's flexible. And that's the same idea with our deep water corals in Alaska. So based on those descriptions, can anybody guess, based on these 4 images, which of these 4 corals are hard corals versus soft corals?
So for those of you in the audience, take a look at those pictures, and I can tell you from experience that it's difficult to tell which ones are soft corals and which ones are hard corals. But which ones do you think are soft corals versus hard corals? So what we're seeing is that we have folks that are thinking that A is a soft coral. Well, actually, so A, C, D are soft and B is hard, says Danielle. Carol is thinking that the soft coral is D and A. Kyle is thinking that B is hard, the rest are soft. Kim thinks that A is a hard coral. It's difficult to tell, isn't it? We're getting answers all across the board. And some people, like Richard, was thinking that all of them are hard. So what can you help us out here with, Rachel?
I'm glad other folks struggle with this too. It really is not intuitive. And it's so you can see how if you're just looking at images of corals, it's difficult to really know. But I did put a bit of a stumper one in there. So I just wanted to show you a real one in person. So A is actually a hard coral. A and D are both hard corals. And this is what one looks like. But A, the picture you're looking at is from the top. And so this is where the polyp would be. And you can see on the side, it's got a really bony skeleton on it. So A and D are actually hard corals. And then you've got soft corals are B and C. And I don't have a specific example of those images, but I do have a soft coral here with me. It's a sea fan, and you can see that it's flexible. It maintains a really nice structure, and it can hold up, but it moves and bends, which is really useful. So not only do we think about growth and age, we want to understand recruitment or home selection, which can be really useful. How do we know where corals are going to settle and decide to grow? So here we've got a picture of juvenile corals, and they're really small, about the size of a grain of rice. And they need a hard surface to attach so that they can start laying down their skeletal material, their sclerites, where they can stay and grow for the rest of their lives. And I don't know if you can see on your computer, but in the polyp on the right, there's a little bud. I circled it in red, and so he's actually starting to grow, this little coral polyp. So he must really like the spot that they chose. But I bet you're wondering, how do we find these juvenile corals in the wild if they're only the size of a grain of rice? I mean, that seems almost impossible, right? What we actually do is we set up underwater experiments where we know that the best place to start looking is where other corals are already growing. So what we do is we can learn about coral recruitment or settlement by putting plates. We call these settlement plates around on the bottom of the ocean around a coral. And then by knowing when the settlement plates were deployed, scientists can approximate recruitment and growth rates when they collect these plates at a later date. And so this summer, actually, these plates are going to be pulled up from the Gulf of Alaska, and they've been down there for over 7 years. So it'll be really interesting to see what corals have colonized these plates and how fast they've grown. So if we can learn about recruitment and increasing coral abundance in a neighborhood, how can we tell how fast each coral colony is growing? Anybody have any thoughts on how we know growth rate in corals? How do we measure coral growth?
So how do you think that scientists can tell how much corals grow each year? We were thinking back on some of the other webinars that we've watched. We have some folks that are saying that maybe they look at rings in the coral structure. Amaya says that they measure them with a ruler. Stella's thinking that maybe they look at use an underwater camera to measure them. Kim is saying that there's layers of calcium carbonate like tree rings, similar to what we were talking about last week with the fish ear stones. And then Theodore was saying you measure it at first and then you come back to it. And then Erde is saying that they put a ring on it, and after a while you see where the ring is. So how can you tell us, what can you tell us about how coral growth is measured?
You know, that was a really good selection of ideas, and honestly, quite a few of those are actually used. And so I'm really impressed with all the great ideas. But just an example that I'm going to talk about is, think about the same way that your parents might have measured you as you're growing up, where you stand up against the wall and they put a measuring tape, mark the wall, and measure how high you are. We do something similar with corals, and one way that we've learned how they grow is we go into the field with scuba for the shallower water ones, and we use an underwater grid that's got 1 centimeter grids on it, and we place that grid behind the coral. We tag specific corals so that we can go back to the same ones each time, and we get measurements on them. And I think Lisa's going to play a video here of an example.
Yes. So I'm going to load up our video here and see whether I can get that started. So that's our short measurement video. And it's just loading up here, and we will get started just As soon as it gets started here. All right, here we go.
You can see the tag, the pink tag that was there before for the coral. And now this is the 1 centimeter grid that they put behind the coral. And what they'll do is they'll take a photo of it once they've got it in focus, and they have the camera set at the same location each time they take that photo. Thanks, Lisa.
Okay, and now, Rachel, I'm going to hand it back to you.
Great. Okay, is it working?
Yep.
Okay, so we just showed the video. All right. So here's an example of one of those corals that was measured over a 3-year period. And instead of measuring the overall height of a coral colony, I don't know if you can see this, but we actually measure we take one branch and we continue to measure that branch each year. Because if you think about the way corals might grow, they might not grow just straight up. They could be growing out and they could be growing 3-dimensionally. But what you do know is that on a branch, the branch will continue to grow in length. So that's what we're measuring. And this coral in particular grew 24 millimeters in 3 years. So that's less than a centimeter per year, which is about the diameter of your belly button each year. So some Alaska corals can get as big as 10 feet tall, 2 to 3 times as big as us. And imagine how long that could take if they're only growing a belly button width each year. So if you know that they grow really slowly, how old do folks think this coral might be?
So if you look at the pictures on the screen, think about what we were just talking about, how slow corals grow. And so how old do you think that the yellow coral on the left is? And how old do you think the one on the right is? So Jody is saying that, actually Trinity is saying that it's 9 years old. Violet is saying it's 850 years old. Kim is saying 100 years old. Jillian says 100. Nadia says 12 years. Texas is estimating 70 years. So we have estimates that are all over the board. We've got everything from 9 years old up to 850, with a couple of 200 years and 50 years and 49 years in the mix there. So what is what's our estimate here for the yellow coral?
Yeah, so the yellow coral, so we actually, for some corals, instead of going down, because this coral is way too deep for scuba divers to go. So what they actually do is use ROVs, and we can snip a sample of the coral and bring it back to the lab. And we use radiocarbon dating, or carbon-14, which is similar to what you would use for dinosaur bones and fossils to date and age that coral. And so the coral on the left is actually over 100 years old and approximately 71 centimeters tall, so about the age of a 3-year-old. And the coral, and another bamboo coral that we found in the Gulf of Alaska seamounts is very similar to the one in the image that you see on the right there. And that coral was over 3 feet tall, about 1 meter, and it was 116 years old. And so we don't know what the oldest coral is in Alaska yet. We're still looking. But so far, science has found that the oldest coral on record is in Hawaii. It's a deep water coral, and it's over 4,000 years old. So we know that deep sea corals are long-lived and slow-growing. This combination makes corals in Alaska vulnerable to disturbance, but also great recorders of biological and oceanographic history. Any questions?
So I've been collecting up all of our questions here. And so you just answered Jaden's question of what's the oldest coral. But Gabby and Maddie were wondering what is the smallest coral?
Well, that's a good question. Well, I mean, technically the smallest coral would be a polyp when it first settles, and it's about the size of a grain of rice. But if you're talking about an adult coral growing, you're going to end up with, I mean, some of the ones like this cup coral are actually going to be relatively small. So they could be maybe a centimeter or less versus 10 feet for our largest corals. Yeah, they can be relatively small.
Great. And then Erde was wondering, why do they have different colors?
Oh, that's a great question. I think it has, in shallow water corals, the color often has to do with the zooxanthellae that they have in their tissues, and those zooxanthellae help with their color. But I'm not really sure about the coloration in deep water. What does anybody else have a thought on what color and why?
From Pam and Vanessa.
I
And
actually looked it up this morning, and I was trying to answer that this morning, and I couldn't come up with a definitive answer.
Yeah, that's something that science maybe still hasn't tackled. I don't know. I do know that some of the corals, like that big bubblegum coral that I showed you at the beginning, that was 150 centimeters, as big as a human, can come in pinks and whites and oranges. So even though it's the same species, it comes in an array of colors. And it's not location based either. So they're not really sure. That's a really great question. So maybe somebody could do some research on that.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that, if you're interested in that, that's a great research question that you could pursue when you become a coral biologist. So Trinity was also wondering whether the stingers are poisonous for animals, even if you can't feel them on your skin.
Yeah, so they actually do. So the nematocysts will stun really tiny plankton, little they're called like copepods and things like that, little small sea creatures that will fit into the mouths of the polyps, and so it stuns them, and then they wrap their tentacles around them and pull them down into their mouths and eat them. Yeah, but for humans, we don't really. It's not enough for us to feel it. It does feel more like like a sticky or tingly.
And then Stella was wondering which corals live longer. Do hard corals or soft corals live longer?
That's, well, we still don't know what the oldest coral is. So it's a really tough one to know. I think that we're still trying to figure out how long corals can really live. So we know that there's a deep sea coral that lives over 4,000 years. And we've got some really old shallow water corals too. I would say that the shallow water corals are more susceptible to changes in water chemistry and things like that. So they may not have as long of a life expectancy because they interact with more of the environment than deep water corals do.
Great. Well, maybe we'll hold on to the rest of our questions because I know that Pam has a lot of stuff to go through, and I will switch the presenter mode over to Pam. Thank you so much, Rachel.
Thank you.
All right, Pam, you're on.
Okay. All right, you can see my screen, right?
Yep.
Okay, now Vanessa has talked to you about corals and feeding, and Rachel's talked to you about corals and how they grow. Next, we're going to talk about corals and a little bit about sponges and why they're so important in Alaska. So I'm curious, do any of you have ideas, like why do we spend all of this time studying corals and sponges in Alaska?
So what do you guys think? Why do you think that it's important to study corals? What do you think, what's the importance of corals, do you think, to the ocean? I think that we are looking at a couple of answers here where Trinity is saying that there are more animals in Alaska, so maybe it's good to look at corals that way. We have some folks that are saying that maybe corals are important in the ecosystem. So Allison is saying important ecosystem for other fish and organisms. Theodore is saying because they distribute good minerals. Richard is saying maybe we could learn more about what it takes for life to thrive in cold climates. Kim is saying that they're shelter for smaller fish and also maybe a food source. And it's good to contrast how they are in cold water versus in warm water, since we know a lot about corals in warmer waters. So we've got a lot of different reasons here why people might want to study corals in Alaska. So what can you tell us about that, Pam?
Well, you all are great. You're really up on your marine science here, and those are all really good ideas. And you're pretty right. They're important for many different reasons. And today we're going to concentrate mostly on corals as habitat in the deep sea. And we like to talk about corals as structure-forming invertebrates. So what does that mean, as structure-forming invertebrates? Well, corals can create complex spaces, such as these corals and sponges, they're both in this image, growing on canyon walls off the Bering Sea slope. Or this coral and sponge garden in the Aleutian Islands. You can tell that they're providing lots of little nooks and crannies. They can also provide areas for animals to hide, camouflage, find food, and they support many different species of animals. So here's a king crab, coral and sponge nearby, and here's a school of fish, both Pacific cod and many different species of rockfish. Now, we've all talked to you so far about corals, and I mentioned a little bit in the beginning of this that we also study sponges. So we didn't have time to really cover both today, but I wanted to give you some images of sponges and talk a little bit about them. Sponges, like corals, come in a variety of shapes and colors. They're animals, not plants. They do attach to hard surfaces, and they filter massive amounts of water. And this is just, these images give you an idea of the variety of sponges that occur in the waters in Alaska. Sponges can also provide areas for fish to hide and camouflage and look for food. And they can provide structures for other organisms to grow on or feed. At the top of this sponge is a sea star called a basket star, and it's using the sponge as a platform for feeding. So there are threats to coral and sponge habitat throughout the world. And in Alaska, some of the threats are fishing and derelict fishing gear. And in these images, you can see a net wrapped around a rock. There's some coiled up cable that's been left on the ground, and another cable going through some coral and sponge habitat. So any type of fishing that comes in contact with the sea floor can potentially impact coral habitat. Also, we think about, or we're concerned about, oil and gas, anchored wind farms, offshore aquaculture, and deep sea mining. All of these industries have structures that need to attach or adhere to the sea floor in order for them to work. So to deal with this problem of habitat destruction, NOAA's Deep Sea Coral Research and Technology Program, which we all work for, was established to coordinate research and make resulting information available for resource managers. And did you know that there's a link between your cell phone and the deep sea? Critical minerals used when making cell phones are found in the same areas of the sea floor of deep sea corals and sponges. All right, so what has Alaska done to protect its amazing coral and sponge habitat? First of all, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which regulates fishing in Alaska, has set up bottom trawl restrictions. And on this map, you'll see the gray areas are all areas where the Management Council has restricted bottom trawling and other types of gear restrictions. The colored dots show you every place that we've identified coral and sponge habitat in the Gulf of Alaska, Aleutian Islands, and the Bering Sea. And you can see the density of those dots definitely increases as you go out into the western Gulf of Alaska and out into the Aleutian Islands. The Management Council has also set up a few no fishing zones specifically for coral habitat. The purple box on the left in the Aleutian Islands shows 6 sites where no fishing is allowed at all. And in the Gulf of Alaska, the red box shows another 4 sites that there's no fishing allowed at all. The Management Council has also set aside the seamounts in Alaska waters and prevented fishing in those areas as well. All right, so I presented to you about habitat and coral and sponge habitat in Alaska. Do you have any questions for me? Or for any of us, actually?
Let's see. So Violet was wondering, do animals or sea life eat coral?
Do animals or sea life eat coral? That's a really good question. Rachel or Vanessa, do you all have any? I don't know the answer to that.
Yeah, I can pipe in. I do know in shallow water corals that butterfly fish actually, and well, butterfly fish will eat live polyps, and they'll actually pull the polyps off the corals and eat them. Apparently they find them very tasty. And parrotfish actually eat the skeletons of corals. And the sand on your beach is actually often the result of parrotfish processing coral, digesting it, and then it comes out as sand at the other end.
That's funny. Theodore was wondering how sponges and corals are different.
Sponges and corals are different structurally, and sponges are more of a filter feeder, whereas the corals feed with their polyps.
Great. So, and I guess, you know, if you think about sponges being, are they softer than corals? I guess you have soft corals and hard corals. So I don't know, maybe they're not.
The sponges come in all different textures. Yeah, so you do have sponges that are actually quite hard and brittle, but they don't have the interior skeleton or the calcium carbonate skeleton that the corals have.
So Pam, you had talked a little bit about threats to corals, like when you were talking about fishing gear and oil rigs and so on. Richard was wondering whether there were other things that can harm coral, like pollution and water temperature changes.
Sure, those are really good questions. And I didn't cover all of the threats to coral, but yes, water pollution absolutely can affect corals, and so can water temperature. We don't know as much about cold water corals and the impacts of the warming oceans and ocean acidification, so I sort of left that out of this talk.
And then let's see, we had a question about Michelle was wondering, are hard corals sharp? I guess could they prick you with their skeletons?
I guess underneath the polyp. Rachel, you want to come back on there?
Sure. Yeah, hard corals. Yeah, I would say they're definitely they're like if you ran into a jagged rock. So they are pretty sharp. I mean, if you ran your hand along a hard coral, you'd probably, all the polyps would not stay on, but the skeleton underneath would probably scratch your hand. So yeah, they don't give, and there's not, it feels like you're scraping over a really rough rock. Yeah.
And then a lot of folks on the line were saying that they didn't realize that there were corals in Alaska. And so Wyatt was wondering, when were corals in Alaska first discovered?
Oh, I have no idea. Rachel, you might know because you've gone through the museum catalogs.
Yeah. Some of the oldest documentation comes from the late 1800s with some really interesting cruises. I think that, you know, if you think about some of the old scientists back in the day doing these research cruises, there's a couple, this researcher named Nutting, he did some research up in Alaska in 1909, I think, where he had some corals, and they're actually saved in museums. So there's some samples from the late 1800s and early 1900s from Alaska.
Wow, that's cool. I had no idea that it went that far back. Well, we have about 16 minutes left, so maybe we should go ahead with your last section, and then we can handle some questions after that.
Okay. All right, our fourth and final segment here today is we're going to talk a little bit, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we study corals. So deep sea corals occur all the way around the world. This map from our deep sea coral portal, which you can access through the NOAA Live website, shows everywhere that corals have been identified. Now, in Alaska, as you might already know, it's pretty dark and cold down there. So how do you think, what are the ideas for, how do you think we'd go down there to study deep sea corals and the ecosystem?
So so actually Theodore was very quick on the keyboard. He said unmanned submarines. We've got a couple people saying, Robin and Kyle are saying ROVs. We've got some other folks saying submersibles, remote vehicles and cameras, submarines, research sub. So that's pretty much our ideas here is underwater unmanned submarines and submersibles. Robin also said maybe drones. So what can you tell us about that, Pam?
Great. Well, you're all right. Yes. So as you saw in Rachel's video earlier, we use scuba diving, and scuba allows us to do detailed inshore work in shallow waters. We also use submersibles. They can go deeper than a scuba diver, obviously. They also a lot of times have robotic arms, so they can collect samples. They can take pictures and videos. The submersibles tend to be expensive, so you have to have some pretty good funding to use those. And there's some concern that the light and noise can scare fish away. So if you're observing more than just the coral and sponge habitat, there's concern about that. We also use what we love to call ROVs, or remotely operated vehicles. These are a great way to study the deep sea. They take images and videos. They can also provide real-time images because they're connected to the vessel through cables, and those images can be broadcast around the world. They can go to the deep sea. They can collect samples. They can go on fairly long dives. Again, they tend to be expensive to be able to use. They need specific ships to be able to deploy them and have the equipment to see the feeds when they come back. And we do worried a little bit about the light and noise scaring fish if we're looking at fish in the habitat as well as corals and sponges. So in Alaska, deep sea research is even more challenging because the waters are remote and the field season is short. There's less mapping information. And at the Alaska Fisheries Science Center, we have an amazing team of researchers who have put together what we call the stereo or dual, meaning two drop camera systems. So they have taken these two cameras and put them side by side with strobe lights on either side. And we can drop these over the side of a vessel. And these cameras take still images. And there's one color and one black and white image. These are fairly short dives, so when we go out to do research, we can have a large sample size. They're inexpensive to put together. The stereo images also allow us to take height measurements, which is fairly important. And their one limitation is that they can only go to 800 meters, whereas subs and ROVs can go much deeper than that. And now Lisa's going to show you a short animated video of what it looks like when we deploy our cameras down under the vessel, off the vessel.
Okay, so here we are loading up our video.
Okay.
And we're about to start here. So don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay. There we go. Okay. So you can see the cameras are attached to the vessel by a cable. There's a person on deck. There's a person on deck.
Unmute yourself again.
Yeah. There's a person on deck with a winch that's controlling the height of the camera in the water. And we try to keep the camera fairly close to the seafloor without crashing into things. And it's the person on the deck controlling the winch who has is making every attempt not to crash into things. And then we have another short video that Lisa's going to fire up here that shows some of the images that come from the color camera.
All right, here we go.
We don't have to play the whole thing, Lisa, if we don't have time. So these are the still frames from the color camera stitched together to make a video. And as you can see, the camera is moving up and down towards the sea floor. When it's close, the strobe lights light it up beautifully. When it's farther away, it's a little hard to identify what we're seeing. But these are images from one of the coral gardens in the Aleutian Islands.
All right, so Pam, I'm going to give the presenter back to you.
Okay.
And so then now you can share your screen again. Yep, you see your slides
We're
again.
good? Okay.
Yep.
All right. So once we're done at sea, we come back to the lab and we process all the images. And the images are loaded into a software program called Sebastes. The researchers who developed the camera system also wrote the code for their software system, which is pretty amazing. So when we open up a video file, we call them videos, but they're actually still frames. On the left, we have little buttons where we can identify the substrate. So we can say whether there's rocks down there or boulders. We have on the right a list of species, so we can identify all the different species that we see. And then we have a tool that allows us to measure individual organisms as long as they are visible in both frames. So what did we discover? Several years ago, we planned 2 research cruises in the Bering Sea and the Aleutian Islands. They were conducted during different summers. They were about 30 days each. In the Bering Sea, we had 250 successful camera drops. And in the Aleutian Islands, we had 216. As you can see, we covered almost about the same amount of area and more in both, a little bit more in the Aleutian Islands. So in the Bering Sea, we saw 70,000 corals and sponges, but 58% of those and 39% were sea whips and sponges. Only 3% were corals and others other than sea whips. Look down at the Aleutian Islands here, and you'll see that in the Aleutian Islands, we identified 325,000 coral and sponge individuals, and they were pretty evenly split, half and half, between corals and sponges. Now this map is part of a story map we put together to tell people about the research we do in Alaska, and the story map link is available on the NOAA Live website. And if you click on this map, on any of the colored squares, the orange or purple squares, information will pop up that tells you about each one of the places that we drop the camera, and it'll tell you the year, the depth, the temperature, and then you'll be able to see some images of what we actually saw down there. So this is a great way to learn about the coral and sponge that occur in the Aleutian Islands and the Bering Sea slope. And that's it. We have
Great.
questions. And I did want to mention the amazing illustrations that were provided in this talk were created by Rachel's dad, Malcolm Wilborn.
And I think that they are just so totally, they're very beautiful illustrations of the corals that you guys study. So I'm very impressed. We have been collecting questions as we go. We've got about another 7 minutes.
Okay.
We did get a
And
question.
Rachel and Vanessa, you want to come back on here?
Yeah, so we got a question about what is your favorite part of your job? So I would like to present that to the 3 of you guys. What's the favorite part of your job that you do? Pam, I'm going to throw it to you first.
Me or Vanessa? I could.
We could go to Vanessa if she knows what the favorite part of her job is.
I really enjoy doing the field work and getting to, hold things in my hands and see where everything is really coming from. It's enjoyable to me.
I would have to agree with that. I like the field work, but also over the past couple of years, I got to spend a lot of time in the lab with Rachel. She's sort of our taxonomist. She's been identifying a lot of these, and that was really exciting to be able to see the samples we collected at sea in the lab and try to identify them. So I learned a lot.
Great. And then Rachel, what's the favorite part of your job for you?
My coworkers. And I also, I did a lot of field work, and I really loved doing field work for a long time, but I switched over to lab work, and I just haven't looked back. I love being in the lab and having the specimens in my hands, and just really getting a good close look at all these things that seem so far out of reach and at such great depths.
Great. We also got a question about whether you guys have discovered any new species of corals during your studies on corals and sponges.
Go
I
ahead. Rick.
haven't since I'm new to this group, but I'm sure the other two have.
We're still discovering new species of corals and sponges. I don't even think we've tapped the sponge species list.
Yeah, no, every year there's probably 2 or 3 new coral species that are coming out. There's a researcher up in Juneau, Bob Stone, who did a lot of work. He recently retired, but he was publishing with another person from Germany and folks. Probably every other year they were doing a new coral species. And we have another person in Seattle that's doing some genetics right now that's with some of the soft corals that we have in Alaska, and we'll probably have a couple new species coming out of that. And sponges, yeah, we're constantly finding new species of sponges. And one of the sponges is really cool because they just found some biomedical use for it. So that was kind of neat.
Wow, that's really cool. And I think as one of our final questions, Theodore had asked really early on whether Pam used to work with horses, because she showed a picture of horses when in her talk about how she came to work on corals. And so he had wanted to know whether she used to work with horses.
Yes, I did. So I was landlocked for much of my life, except for my summers. And I started with horses, working with horses at the age of 6, and continued quite a lot teaching and training horses until college. And then when I left college and headed to Alaska, I had to give that up. But I certainly passed that love for horses on to my daughter, and she is now a horse person.
That's great. And actually, in a related way, we had a couple of questions about the variety of jobs that you guys did as you were going through your careers. And so I was wondering whether the 3 of you might be able to share with our audience what piece of advice you would give for students as they're looking to maybe go into something like studying corals or studying marine life. What piece of advice would you give for them?
One thing that I would say is that I found useful as a young person was to try volunteering, because you can try a lot of different things and find out what you like, but also what you don't like. So it's a nice opportunity to do that before you commit to maybe a field in college or something like that.
I agree. I would say try lots of different things. And I've done many jobs in my life, and sometimes I thought I was going to fall in love with something and then started working in a field and absolutely hated it. Younger, like I said, I started pre-med, and I didn't want to be inside. And I took an ecology class, and it totally changed my career path. So I would say, try different things. And don't be afraid to try something and say you don't like it and change.
Yeah, those are both really great. I think flexibility is a really good thing. And one of the things I remember when I was looking into majoring in marine biology is a lot of times folks wanted to know what you were interested in, and just saying that you were interested in an organism, like if you wanted to work with dolphins or sharks or corals, there's so many different areas of it. It's more focused on what aspect, maybe because you could do genetics for dolphins and you would never actually be in contact with a live dolphin in your life because you're in a lab working on genetics. So just really thinking about what aspect of what science field you want to approach these organisms from is a really interesting way to think about it. And it was really helpful for me to help me figure out what things I liked and didn't like. So yeah, that's what I would suggest.
Well, great. Thank you guys so much. Pam, I'm wondering whether you could go to our last slide.
Oh,
and I
yep,
just wanted
sorry.
to thank you Thank all of our speakers for presenting to us today. We learned a tremendous amount about deep water corals in Alaska, and I wanted to thank all of our audience members for signing in and asking so many great questions, because we got way more questions that we could answer during this time. But I think there was a lot of interest in the material that you guys presented today. So thank you very much. And thanks to our audience, and we'll be back next week with another webinar.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.